Before you can understand the present, you must first understand the past.
Talk to us about Micheal Collins, his importance in our history. We speak about an awful lot of important people throughout our history. Joe, where do you place Mr. Collins, or is that even disrespectful to ask?
I know. I have to say I had a heavy heart yesterday, and it was a little bit emotional. I know it was a state celebration we had yesterday at Belnabla, and your previous contribution about place names, there's such a division over what actually Belnabla means, but that was the place where he was shot dead. And look, he was a great Irishman. People need to understand he was only 31 when he died. He was a young man that brought the British Empire to its knees in this country that we'd been trying for 800 years. And just emotionally for myself, like I really do, I think it was lovely. In his last entry in his diary on the 21st of August, he said, "People are splendid." He really believed in the people of Ireland, and he was very passionate about the people of Ireland. And you couldn't but feel the loss of such a wonderful person to our nation at such a young age. And sadly, it was our own that killed him. And that's a sad part of our history. But look, I was very proud to put up my tricolour yesterday, and I have it flying today. I think it's a momentous occasion, 100 years ago, actually today, that Micheal Collins was shot dead. Possibly the greatest Irishman that ever lived.
Okay, well, we'll talk about his death. How did he become to be arguably one of, or the greatest Irishman to have ever lived? Take us back to his early life and then how he came to be in such a position of influence.
Well, look, from Cork and near Clonakilty, that's where he was educated, and he sat the British Civil Service, had a kind of an exam system, and he sat that exam when he was about 15. Now, his father was about 75 when he was born, and he says, "Micheal will do great things." And Micheal was only 6 when his father died. And Micheal did do great things. He passed that exam, and then he went to work in London for 10 years. He worked in a post office there, Blythe House Post Office. And while he was in London in 1906, those 10 years, he became very much involved in lots of different Irish cultural movements. The GA, which he played in, he was part of the administration, the Conradh na Gaeilge, the Irish language movement. And more importantly, he became involved in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And it was the famous Sam Maguire, the Sam Maguire Cup, who was in London, who actually was a Protestant as well. That's interesting to point that out. It was he that brought him into the Irish Republican Brotherhood and influenced him. He had obviously those ideals from youth, but Sam had a big influence on him. And so he got another job then, and he was there to 1915. He actually was studying law in London as well. But previous to 1916, he just came home. And then in 1916, he was involved. He was in the GPO in 1916. And interestingly enough, he was the aide-de-camp. He was the right-hand man of Joseph Mary Plunkett. So that was Collins's involvement in 1916. And then he wasn't court-martialed, but he was sent to Fonga. It was an internment camp. And Micheal had learned a lot of administration skills while he was in London, working with the Postal Service. He seemed to be a natural organizer, a very intelligent, bright, capable, a man of great skill in being able to read situations and work with people and motivate. It seemed to have just a natural gift. He was endowed with that. And so really, it's something that the English never learned from. I mean, we had that with the H-blocks later. When they interred all these men, it really became universities for the revolution. So 1916 was over. All these men were interred, including Micheal Collins. And actually, there's a lovely photograph of Joe Sweeney from Dunlow with Micheal Collins in Fonga, had the two of them leaning over a banister. There's other men in it as well. But when Collins got out, he knew he was going to create hell for the British back in Ireland. And he was released in December 1918. But in the meantime, he'd created cells throughout the whole of Ireland. And the War of Independence would become rural Ireland's 1916. We didn't get the chance to rise out in 1916. So Collins made sure that he had his sales worked out, he had his strategy worked out, and really that was the beginning of Collins. And he came home then, and it was Kathleen Clark, Tom Clark's wife, that managed to get him a job, the National Aid and Volunteers Dependence Fund. But really, it was really a central position in gathering information and intelligence on the British. And so then, obviously, we know then in 1918, there was the election of Sinn Féin TDs rather than MPs, and the first Dáil then was formed in January 1919. And Micheal was elected for Cork, South Cork, so he became an MP or a TD and attended the first Dáil and was made Minister for Finance by De Valera. So that was his main role to that point. And then he was appointed in about September of 1919. So shortly after the formation of the first Dáil, he was made Director of Intelligence for the IRA and Organiser for the Volunteers. And to be honest, he was the brains behind the War of Independence. Obviously, there were other people as well, but he coordinated it. And he was able to cycle around through Dublin. And he was one of the most wanted men in the British Empire at the time, and they weren't able to discover him.
Yeah, well, with that in mind, I mean, obviously, you're talking about the various roles that he held. He was involved in the organisation of attacks on police and assassinations and what have you. How was that covered? Were both of his roles common knowledge? You talked about him having, being wanted man but free to cycle the streets of Dublin as such. But how was he perceived amongst the public here or in the press?
Yeah, well, it was interesting at the time. People knew of him and there was a reward for him, but they knew him and knew of him, but nobody ever gave evidence or spied on him or gave him up, so to speak. And that says a lot about the Irish people at the time, that they knew what he was trying to do and setting out to do. Now, he didn't get involved actively himself. He had a squad, and we know the story. We talked before about a Bloody Sunday in November 1920. It was Collins that was behind that with his gang. And his idea was he knew he couldn't. I mean, the man was so intelligent. I mean, we talked before about Red Hugh O'Donnell. And I would put Red Hugh O'Donnell and Micheal Collins on the same level. Like what Red Hugh achieved in his time, Micheal Collins achieved in 1919, 1921. And what he realised was he couldn't take on the British Empire. Their army was next to none. The Britannia rules the waves. They had a quarter of their world. Their army was next to none. And he realised, look, the only way we can take on the British army is to take out their eyes, like a cat catching a mouse. And he says, I need to take out their eyes. And their eyes were their intelligence. And so on Bloody Sunday, he had 11 of their top intelligence officers executed, summarily executed. There was nothing nice about it. They were just murdered, shot dead. And so therefore, all this intelligence that they had in Dublin Castle was of no good to them because they didn't know the people, the brains behind it, weren't able to explain it. And so the English realised very quickly that this is what was going on. And he masterminded all that, and he was very good at penetrating into the British intelligence system. And anybody that's watched the film Micheal Collins would know of Ned Broy, who was working in Dublin Castle, and he gave information. But they eventually caught on to him and knew what he was doing. And maybe that brings us maybe later on to the treaty. Collins knew that he could only go so far with guerrilla tactics. Arms were getting short, ammunitions were getting short, intelligence was getting tighter. He knew as time went on that this was getting more and more difficult. And at the same time, for example, the likes of De Valera, who he managed to get, he planned his escape from Lincoln prison, and De Valera then went to America for 18 months on a propaganda tour. Collins was left with a lot of responsibility. And remember, at this stage, he was 28, 29. He was a very, very young man.
But given all that, he had to be accepted. He was one of the negotiators of the treaty. I mean, how would he have been received, I wonder, over in England?
Well, that's a brilliant question. What they faced,
and remarkably, it's not one you gave me. I actually come up with that all by myself.
A fabulous question. Yeah, they faced a formidable team, probably one of the best political teams ever put before them. Like they had Chamberlain, Lloyd George, Birkenhead and Churchill. These were the people that Collins, Duggan, Horace Plunkett, Griffith and Barton had to face. So they were up against it. But what people don't realise is that De Valera had already met Lord George about 4 times in London previous to the negotiations.
The groundwork was set, was it?
There was a groundwork set. One of the things that Lloyd George did when De Valera arrived over the first time, he made sure that there was a massive map of the British Empire put behind Lloyd George where he sat, so as to let a little dot Ireland to see what England controlled. And here, this is what you're negotiating with. So that was a very psychologically, these men knew what they were doing.
Right. So to use common terms, then, sort of in a modern way, what would have been the red lines for the Irish party and the red line for the British party? In other words, compromise was going to have to be reached. There was going to have to be give and take, but were there red lines?
There were red lines, but the red lines weren't always straight, if that makes sense. Okay. I think that's a good political answer.
Yeah,
to that
I think
one.
so, yeah.
You see, if you look at the previous negotiations back as far as 1914, the intention was that there would be a government in Northern Ireland, Belfast, and that there would be a home rule government in Dublin. And that after 7 years, the 2 governments would form as one. That was what was proposed in 1914. That didn't happen, as we know, with the Government of Ireland Act. Northern Ireland was established, the 6 counties. And then, obviously, we know the War of Independence happened subsequently. So what they were negotiating for, 6 counties was off the table. Now, that wasn't the way that the Republicans were looking at it. No, we didn't fight for a 26-county Ireland. It was already a red line for the British negotiations. For the Irish negotiations, the hard line would have been Cathal Brugha and people like that, the real staunch Republicans. And De Valera had managed to convince them that they would accept Dominion status to a certain degree, that meaning that the king would still be in charge technically, but the oath wouldn't be as strong. And he was saying, look, this is something we'll work at eventually, and it'll dissipate over time. And De Valera had seemingly got them on board. So, look, the negotiations were very difficult. People will always ask why De Valera wasn't there. Cosgrave often said that it was the best player didn't go to play on the field. De Valera's attitude was, well, the king wasn't there, and he seen himself as the president of the Irish Republic, so he wasn't going. And it was a safety valve if they weren't happy with the treaty.
Yes, and we could, but some might sort of go, well, okay, well, that's fine. He came home, and everyone agreed, and that was, but it was not easy, presumably, to get this over the line. It would have to have been accepted in the Dáil and across general society as well. Like, was it 50-50 in people's opinion as to whether, because as you say, and you can hear how important it is out of Kyiv when they talk of Crimea, and how important it is to retain that, to have that return to them to secure peace there. I presume the same kind of... How could anyone celebrate this type of outcome to negotiations that meant, 6 of your counties were gone?
Yeah, well, that was a reality that they already had lived with in 1920, but they hadn't accepted it.
It ratifies it, though.
Yeah, it does. And Collins, what people maybe don't realise, and this will bring us maybe into another subject later on, the Drumbo martyrs in their own county. I mean, they were sent, Enright, Charlie Daly particularly, Enright, Daly and O'Sullivan, they were sent to Donegal to continue the northern struggle. So Collins was still fighting for the 6 counties in that sense. And he'd made a pact with De Valera, look, we'll fight over the treaty, but we'll go into coalition after the election in 1920. And when Lloyd George heard this, he got very, very annoyed. So the treaty, there was differences in the treaty. And eventually, look, the reality is eventually De Valera had to accept it. And the question maybe for historians, and the question I would ask is, why did the Dáil not say we're not accepting this, and go back to London and see what more could be leveraged, and then come back? But I think the decision was made rather quickly.
But you talked about those earlier meetings. I mean, how much of this in reality was already decided? And what followed was, was just dramatics. Do you know? In other words, was the deal done?
To some degree, the deal was done, and I think Collins realised that. I mean, again, more than anybody, he probably was acutely aware of the armament situation with his volunteers. You know, we couldn't keep fighting the British Army. I mean, they threatened a terrible war within 3 days, sorry. He realised the pressure he was under from the IRA's point of view and what they could endure further. They were at depleted stocks. It wasn't just possible to keep this going. And so his understanding was this was a step towards full freedom, using this freedom of the 26 counties to fight for the other 6 counties. Something that no Irish government has ever done in our history, to fight. We basically abandoned the 6 counties historically, and that wasn't Collins' ideal. And as I said to you, he was still encouraging the Northern campaign. As I said, he sent men to Donegal. And so his concept was, look, we'll still fight for these 6 counties. And what was promised as well, and it's very
I wonder if we could maybe we could come back to this element of this story, especially given the local interest in this, Joe. And I'd love to go for hours, but we can't. So I want to get to his murder. And I know RTE have got a load of talking heads together to sort of suppose what may or may not have happened. But you said right from the beginning, it ended up he was taken out by one of his own. So talk to us about his death in the last 4 minutes that we have, please, Joe.
Well, very quickly, he was doing a tour of Cork, leaving Cork. And while going through Belnabad, the men that were waiting, they had heard that he was in the area. They had decided to ambush him. They'd been waiting quite a while. They were ready to abandon the ambush. And then the next thing, they had pulled a cart across when they heard he was coming. Shots were fired, and Collins was the only man that died in it.
And he said he would never be shot in Cork, didn't he?
He said, Asher, they'll never kill me in Ireland. That was his concept, that, you know, that he would be immune to that. Having said that, Birkenhead said to him when he was signing the treaty, you might have signed your own political death certificate. He says, no, he says, I've actually signed my actual death cert. And he was quite correct in that.
And who would have done it, and what's the motivation?
Oh, there's there's a lot of controversy over that.
But you must have settled on a view on this, Joe.
I will look at it. Was done certainly by the Republican side. There's no question about that. The intention by the ambush was to kill. There's no doubt about that. And unfortunately, Micheal Collins was killed, and that was that. And there's no glazing or sugarcoating that reality. But the facts are that he was shot by his own countrymen, and when he was shot, he says, "No revenge." He shouted to his comrades, "No revenge, no revenge." And one thing that's very important to say: Collins, during the Civil War, did not want any of his former colleagues to be executed. To think that later on Kevin O'Higgins and the Free State government would execute 77, he didn't want that to go. And there's one thing that's very, very important to say, and I realise we're cut for time. He said one important line, and it ties in with one of your earlier contributors there earlier on. And I just want to say this line: we have to learn that freedom imposes responsibility. We are going to have United Ireland that Micheal Collins dreamed of. But there's a responsibility on us now to figure out what United Ireland that is going to be. And I heard your Pádraig McLaughlin TD talk about that. I think it doesn't belong to any political party. But the reality is a United Ireland is going to happen. And on the anniversary of Micheal Collins, maybe it's time we start having a discussion as to what does that mean?
The realities of it as well, even the not even just obviously, just the practicalities of it.
Yes.
You know, in terms of even the postal service, you know,
hospitals, education, even the controversy in Irish language. We have to figure a way out, and fail to prepare to fail. And I think Highland is ideally, I've said this before, ideally positioned to have that conversation, because you straddle both north and south, and also all communities and traditions. Or maybe you're very welcoming to that conversation.
You'll be part of that conversation. It might be something that we plan and discuss, and actually, you know, mock it up as if it's about to happen, and how do we do it, and what needs to be done. We might work on that. Listen, I think it's a good thing that we always feel we don't have enough time. You know, because we have been talking for half an hour, and yet we've run out of time again. Thank you so much for your time, as always. It's really informative, and I know the listeners love it. Thanks, Joe. We'll chat again very soon. Slán. Okay, that's Dr. Joe Kelly there.